The moment my CEO handed the promotion to his nephew, something inside me broke. I had spent 7 years delivering record profits, leading winning projects, and doing everything they said would earn me that role. None of it mattered. Then, as the room erupted in applause, an investor opened a confidential file, and my CEO suddenly looked terrified. My name is Nolan Mercer, and for most of my adult life, I believed hard work eventually spoke for itself. I worked for a logistics company called North Axis Logistics in Denver, Colorado. When I joined, we were a growing regional operation trying to compete with companies 3 times our size. 7 years later, we had become one of the fastest-growing logistics firms in the Western United States. I wasn't a founder. I wasn't related to anyone important. I didn't play golf with executives on weekends. I just worked. The kind of work nobody noticed until something went wrong. The kind of work that kept major clients happy, solved problems at 2 in the morning, and saved contracts that should have been lost months earlier. By my 6th year, people throughout the company knew my name. Not because I was loud, because I delivered. If a project was failing, it usually landed on my desk. If a client threatened to leave, I got the phone call. If a department missed targets, somehow I was always involved in fixing it. Over time, I became one of the company's top-performing operations leaders. And I wasn't the only one. There was Elaine Porter, a brilliant senior operations director who could identify supply chain problems before they even appeared in the data. There was Victor Kane, one of the sharpest financial analysts I'd ever worked with. And there were dozens of other people quietly carrying the company forward while executives took credit during shareholder presentations. For years, most of us accepted that, because we believed there would eventually be opportunities to move up. Then the rumors started. Our CEO, Grant Holloway, was preparing to create a new executive position, an executive director role, a role with real influence, real authority, the kind of position that could completely change someone's career. The moment the announcement leaked internally, excitement spread through the company. People began updating leadership portfolios. Department heads started discussing candidates. Managers debated who deserved it most. For once, it felt like performance might actually matter. And honestly, if you had asked employees who would get the role, most would have mentioned the same handful of names. Elaine, a few senior directors, maybe me, people with years of experience, people who had earned respect, people who had proven themselves repeatedly. Nobody mentioned Bryce Holloway. At that point, most employees barely knew who he was. Bryce had joined North Axis less than a year earlier. Officially, he worked in strategic development. Unofficially, everyone knew he was the CEO's nephew. At first, nobody seemed concerned. Companies hired relatives all the time. As long as they did the work, most employees didn't care. But Bryce was different. The rules never seemed to apply to him. He arrived late, missed deadlines, showed up unprepared to meetings, and somehow, none of it ever appeared to matter. Managers who aggressively criticized everyone else suddenly became strangely quiet around him. Projects he touched often ended up being completed by other employees. Yet during executive meetings, Bryce somehow received credit anyway. The first few times it happened, people brushed it off. Maybe we were missing something. Maybe he was contributing behind the scenes. Maybe the CEO simply saw potential nobody else could see. But as the months passed, those explanations became harder and harder to believe. Then something happened that started making people uncomfortable. Bryce began appearing in leadership meetings he wasn't supposed to attend. Meetings normally reserved for senior directors, executive planning sessions, growth strategy discussions, budget reviews, the kinds of meetings experienced leaders spent years trying to access. Meanwhile, people like Elaine and I still had to fight for invitations. I remember walking into one strategy session and seeing Bryce casually sitting at the table scrolling through his phone while senior leaders waited for the meeting to begin. Nobody said anything, but the room felt different. You could feel it. The frustration, the confusion, the growing realization that the promotion process might not be a process at all. At the time, I tried convincing myself I was overthinking it. I told myself the company wouldn't risk its credibility for one person. I told myself performance still mattered. I told myself 7 years of results couldn't simply be ignored. Looking back now, that was probably the last time I truly believed the system was fair. A month after the executive director position was officially announced, the selection process began. At least, that's what they called it. A selection process. The company released internal guidelines explaining how candidates would be evaluated. Leadership performance, project results, department growth, employee retention, strategic planning, and executive interviews would all factor into the final decision. On paper, it looked fair, professional, transparent. Exactly the kind of process you'd expect from a company preparing for its next stage of growth. For the first time in years, people were genuinely excited. Not just me. Across North Axis, high performers suddenly had something tangible to work toward. You could feel the energy. Department leaders stayed late preparing presentations. Managers updated performance reports. Teams started pushing harder. For a few weeks, the entire company seemed motivated by the idea that effort might finally be rewarded. I threw myself into the process, not because I felt entitled to the promotion, because I honestly believed I had a legitimate shot. Over 7 years, I had helped secure some of the company's largest contracts. I had rebuilt failing divisions, reduced operational costs, improved delivery performance, retained clients worth millions in annual revenue. My record wasn't perfect. Nobody's was. But it was real. And unlike some people, I had earned every line on my resume. The first round of evaluations went better than expected. Candidates completed leadership assessments, presented growth strategies, participated in executive interviews, submitted detailed performance records. The process was intense, but it felt legitimate, until whispers started spreading through the building. The first rumor came from a manager in finance, then another from HR, then someone from strategic planning. Different departments, different people, same concern. Bryce wasn't doing well. His evaluation scores were reportedly near the bottom of the candidate pool. His interview performance had been weak. Several executives privately questioned whether he was ready for senior leadership. At first, I ignored the rumors. Corporate offices generate gossip every day. But then something happened that made me pay attention. I was called into a meeting with a senior vice president reviewing leadership candidates. The discussion lasted nearly an hour. We talked about operational strategy, future expansion, leadership philosophy, risk management. At the end, he leaned back in his chair. "You've built a strong case for yourself, Nolan." I thanked him. Then he said something strange. "Whatever happens, don't assume this process is entirely in our hands." I remember staring at him. "What does that mean?" He hesitated. For a second, it looked like he wanted to say more. Instead, he forced a smile. "Just keep doing what you're doing." The conversation ended there. But something about it stayed with me. A week later, things became even stranger. Several department leaders were asked to review preliminary candidate rankings. The rankings were confidential. Only a handful of executives had access. Yet somehow people started hearing about them. And according to multiple sources, Bryce wasn't even close to the top. Not top 3, not top 5, nowhere near it. Meanwhile, names like Elaine Porter kept appearing at the top. Mine appeared consistently near the top as well. The company had spent months evaluating candidates, and the results apparently reflected reality. The people producing results were leading. The people who weren't. For a brief moment, I felt relieved. Maybe I had misjudged the situation. Maybe the company actually intended to make the right decision. Then the rankings disappeared. Literally. One day executives were discussing them. The next day nobody could access them. Internal dashboards were locked. Reports vanished. Meetings were suddenly canceled. Questions stopped getting answers. People who normally shared information became silent. The entire atmosphere shifted overnight. It felt like everyone had received the same warning. Stop asking questions. Then another strange detail surfaced. Bryce started showing up with information he shouldn't have known. Confidential project updates, private strategic discussions, leadership recommendations, sensitive financial forecasts, details restricted to senior leadership teams. Yet somehow he always seemed one step ahead. One afternoon, I sat in a planning meeting discussing a major client expansion. The conversation was confidential. Less than 24 hours later, Bryce referenced details from that meeting during a completely unrelated discussion. The room went quiet. Everyone noticed. Nobody challenged him. Because everyone already knew the answer. Someone at the top was feeding him information. The deeper problem wasn't Bryce. It was the protection surrounding him. Every mistake was excused. Every weakness was ignored. Every concern disappeared before reaching the surface. Then came the final warning sign. Managers throughout the company began receiving calls from executive leadership. Not official instructions, not written directives. Phone calls, quiet conversations, subtle pressure. They were encouraged to publicly support Bryce, encouraged to discuss his leadership potential, encouraged to reinforce confidence in the CEO's vision. The message wasn't difficult to understand. The decision had already been made. The promotion process was becoming theater. The evaluations, the interviews, the rankings, the months of preparation. None of it mattered. One Friday afternoon, I walked past a conference room and noticed several executives gathered inside. Grant Holloway was speaking. Bryce sat beside him, laughing, relaxed, comfortable, like someone who already knew the outcome. I stood there for a moment watching through the glass. And that's when I felt something I hadn't felt during this entire process. Not frustration, not disappointment, betrayal. Because for years, people like me had sacrificed weekends, vacations, and family time, believing performance created opportunity. Now it was becoming painfully obvious that the winner had been chosen long before the competition started. And we had all been invited to participate in a game we were never allowed to win. Then Monday morning arrived. An email appeared in every employee's inbox. Mandatory company-wide leadership announcement. Tuesday, 10 a.m. Attendance required. The moment I saw it, my stomach dropped. I already knew what was coming. I just wasn't prepared for how bad it was about to get. Tuesday morning felt different the second I walked into headquarters. Nobody was talking about projects. Nobody was talking about clients. Nobody was talking about quarterly targets. The only thing anyone cared about was the announcement. Groups of employees stood near coffee stations whispering. Managers who normally carried themselves confidently looked tense. Even people who claimed not to care about promotions seemed unusually quiet. Deep down, I think everyone was hoping they were wrong. Hoping the rumors weren't true. Hoping the company still had enough common sense left to reward competence over connections. At exactly 10 o'clock, employees packed into the main auditorium. Others joined remotely. The room buzzed with nervous energy. Then Grant Holloway walked onto the stage. Confident, relaxed, smiling. The kind of smile people wear when they already know nobody can challenge them. Bryce followed a few seconds later. That was the moment the room changed. You could almost feel hundreds of people arriving at the same conclusion simultaneously. Nobody needed an announcement anymore. Nobody needed confirmation. We already knew. Grant spent several minutes talking about growth, leadership, vision, the future. Then he finally said it. Please join me in congratulating our new executive director, Bryce Holloway. For a split second, complete silence filled the room. Then people started clapping. Not because they were excited, because that's what employees do when executives are watching. The applause sounded forced, mechanical, lifeless. I clapped too, a few slow taps of my hands against each other, nothing more. Inside, I felt numb. 7 years. 7 years of sacrifices. 7 years of proving myself. 7 years of believing performance mattered. And in less than 10 seconds, all of it felt worthless. I glanced around the room. The reactions told the story. Elaine stared straight ahead without moving. Several senior managers exchanged frustrated looks. Others simply looked defeated. Nobody seemed surprised, but plenty of people looked crushed. Grant continued praising Bryce's leadership qualities. The words felt disconnected from reality. Most employees barely knew Bryce. The people who did know him certainly weren't describing him as a future executive. Yet there he was, standing on stage, receiving the promotion everyone else had spent months competing for. The worst part wasn't losing. The worst part was realizing the outcome had never depended on merit in the first place. When the meeting ended, employees filed out quietly. The hallways felt like a funeral. Nobody openly complained. Nobody needed to. The disappointment was written all over their faces. Back at my desk, I stared at my computer screen for nearly 10 minutes without doing any work. Emails continued arriving. Meetings continued appearing on my calendar. Clients continued needing support. The business kept moving. But mentally, I was somewhere else. For the first time since joining North Axis, I seriously considered leaving. Not immediately, not emotionally, strategically. Because if promotions were determined by family connections, what future was there for people like me? What exactly was I working toward? That question followed me home that evening. And the evening after that, and the week after that. I became quieter, more distant. My motivation disappeared. Even my family noticed. One night during dinner, my wife finally put down her fork. "Nolan, what's going on?" I tried giving the usual answer. "Nothing." She raised an eyebrow. "That's not true." I looked down at my plate. For a few seconds, I couldn't think of anything to say. Then everything came out. The promotion, the favoritism, the frustration, the feeling that years of effort had been erased. She listened without interrupting. When I finally finished, she leaned back in her chair. "You know what hurts the most?" I looked at her. "You still think you're angry because you didn't get promoted." "What do you mean?" "I think you're angry because they made you believe the rules mattered when they never intended to follow them." That hit harder than I expected. Because she was right. This wasn't about a title anymore. It was about trust. Trust in leadership. Trust in the system. Trust that hard work would eventually be rewarded, and all of it had just collapsed. Over the next few weeks, morale across the company continued deteriorating. Top performers stopped volunteering for extra projects. Managers stopped pushing as hard. Several respected employees quietly resigned. Others started interviewing elsewhere. The damage spread faster than leadership realized, and Bryce wasn't helping. Within his first month as executive director, mistakes started piling up. Projects stalled, deadlines slipped, decisions got delayed. Departments became increasingly frustrated. But despite all of it, Grant continued defending him. No matter what happened. No matter how obvious the problems became. Then one afternoon, something unexpected happened. I received a call from a longtime client. A client worth millions to North Axis. After discussing business for a few minutes, he lowered his voice. "Nolan, can I ask you something?" "Sure." There was a pause. Then he asked, "Is Bryce Holloway really running things now?" The question caught me off guard. "Why do you ask?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Because several clients are starting to get nervous." That conversation changed everything. Because for the first time, I realized this wasn't just an internal employee problem anymore. The concerns were spreading beyond the walls of North Axis. And once clients start noticing leadership failures, investors are usually not far behind. That client call stayed in my head for days. Not because it shocked me, because it confirmed something I had been trying to ignore. The people running North Axis were no longer the only people noticing the damage. Clients were noticing it too. And clients notice things long before executives realize there's a problem. They notice delayed responses, missed commitments, confusing decisions, unnecessary complications. They notice when confidence disappears, and confidence was disappearing fast. A year earlier, I probably would have reacted emotionally, updated my resume, started interviewing, walked away. But something had changed. Maybe it was the years I had invested. Maybe it was the employees being punished for someone else's incompetence. Or maybe I was simply tired of watching powerful people rewrite reality while everyone else stayed quiet. Whatever the reason, I decided not to leave. Not yet. Instead, I started paying attention, really paying attention. For years, I had focused on solving problems. Now, I started studying them. Every delayed project, every failed initiative, every decision that didn't make sense, every situation where Bryce's involvement somehow made things worse. I wasn't looking for revenge, at least that's what I kept telling myself. I was looking for the truth, and the truth was becoming difficult to ignore. The first person who quietly approached me was Elaine Porter. We met after work at a small coffee shop a few blocks from headquarters. Neither of us mentioned the promotion at first. We talked about operations, clients, staff turnover, normal things. Then Elaine leaned forward. "Tell me I'm not crazy." I already knew what she meant. "You're not." She exhaled slowly. "Good." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she opened her laptop. What she showed me immediately got my attention. Operational performance reports, department metrics, project completion trends. At first glance, the numbers looked normal. Then she pointed to several sections. "We've been declining for months." I looked closer. She was right. Not catastrophic declines. Not yet, but clear declines. Enough to matter. Enough to raise questions. "What happened?" I asked. Elaine laughed bitterly. "You know exactly what happened." I did. But neither of us said Bryce's name. We didn't have to. Over the following weeks, more people quietly joined the conversation. Not formally. Not as some organized group. Just professionals comparing notes, trying to understand what was happening to the company they had helped build. That's when I started spending more time with Victor Kane. If Elaine understood operations, Victor understood numbers, and numbers don't care about politics. They don't care about family connections. They don't care about executive narratives. Numbers tell the truth eventually. One evening, Victor invited me into his office after most employees had gone home. He closed the door, lowered the blinds, then pulled up several financial dashboards. "What you're about to see stays here." I nodded. Victor rotated his monitor toward me. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Revenue looked stable. Expenses looked manageable. Growth projections remained positive. Then he started clicking through detailed reports. And suddenly the picture changed. Client retention was slipping. Profit margins were narrowing. Operational inefficiencies were increasing. Certain projects were significantly over budget. Several of those projects shared something in common. Bryce had approved them. My stomach tightened. "How many people know this?" Victor looked at me. "Not many." "Why?" "Because most people aren't seeing the full data." That answer bothered me. A lot. "Meaning?" Victor hesitated, then pointed towards several reporting categories. "The executive dashboards aren't showing everything." I stared at him. "What do you mean they're not showing everything?" He rubbed his jaw, like he was deciding how much he should say. "Let's just say the version executives are looking at isn't always the same version everyone else sees." For a moment, neither of us spoke, because the implication was obvious. Somebody was controlling what information reached leadership. Or leadership was controlling what information reached everyone else. Neither possibility was good. The following month made everything worse. Bryce launched a new strategic initiative that he promoted aggressively. According to him, it would modernize operations and accelerate growth. According to reality, it became a disaster. Deadlines were missed. Costs exploded. Departments complained. Clients became frustrated. Employees worked nights and weekends trying to repair problems that should never have existed. And somehow Bryce continued receiving praise from Grant Holloway. Every failure became someone else's responsibility. Every success became Bryce's achievement. The disconnect was becoming impossible to hide. Then another unexpected development occurred. A senior manager I trusted shared something disturbing. Several major investors had started requesting additional information. Not routine information, specific information, performance metrics, project outcomes, leadership effectiveness data. The kind of information investors usually request when they suspect something is wrong. That was the moment my thinking changed. Until then, I had assumed this was a company problem, an internal problem, a leadership problem. But investors don't ask difficult questions unless money is at risk. And once investors start worrying about their money, everything changes. Because unlike employees, Investors don't care who the CEO's nephew is. They care about results. Over the next several weeks, I became meticulous. I documented timelines, saved reports, recorded project outcomes, tracked decisions. Not because I planned to use them, because something told me a day was coming when facts would matter more than opinions. And if that day arrived, I wanted the truth preserved. What I didn't know was that the biggest discovery wasn't hidden inside operations, or project management, or client reports. It was buried inside the company's reporting system itself. And when Victor finally uncovered it, even he looked shaken. By the time the next quarterly investor review approached, the atmosphere inside North Axis had become impossible to ignore. Employees felt it, managers felt it, clients definitely felt it. The only people pretending everything was fine seemed to be Grant Holloway and Bryce. Every company has warning signs. Missed targets, declining morale, customer complaints, higher turnover. At North Axis, those signs were everywhere, yet somehow every executive presentation continued telling the same story. Strong growth, healthy performance, positive outlook, future opportunities. It was like living in two different realities at the same time. The reality employees experienced every day, and the reality executives kept presenting. The gap between those realities kept bothering me. It bothered Victor too. And unlike most people, Victor had access to places where answers sometimes lived. One Thursday evening, he called me. His voice sounded different, tighter, more serious. "Nolan, can you come by? Now?" "Yeah." A pause. "You're going to want to see this." 20 minutes later, I was sitting inside Victor's office. The building was mostly empty. Outside the windows, Denver's skyline glowed against the night sky. Victor didn't waste time. He closed the door and immediately turned his monitor toward me. "What am I looking at?" "Executive reporting files." I frowned. "Okay. Look closer." At first, the reports looked normal. Performance dashboards, operational summaries, financial forecasts. The same types of reports executives reviewed every month. Then Victor opened a second version, and my stomach dropped. The numbers weren't the same. Not slightly different. Completely different. Certain performance declines had disappeared. Cost overruns looked smaller. Project failures appeared less severe. Several troubling trends were missing entirely. For a moment I thought I was misunderstanding something. There has to be an explanation. Victor gave a humorless laugh. "There is." He clicked through additional files. More comparisons appeared. Again and again, internal data on one side, executive reports on the other. The differences weren't random. They were selective, intentional, designed to tell a specific story. A story where Bryce looked successful. A story where leadership decisions appeared justified. A story where investors had no reason to worry. My chest tightened. Who changed them? Victor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened another file, an audit log, user access records, modification histories, digital timestamps, the kind of records most employees never see. Then he pointed to a specific entry. I read it once, then again, just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. My mouth went dry, because the name attached to the authorization wasn't Bryce. It wasn't a department manager. It wasn't some rogue employee. It was Grant Holloway, the CEO himself. For several seconds, I just stared at the screen. No. Victor nodded slowly. I checked 3 times. My heart started pounding, because this changed everything. Until that moment, Bryce had been the problem. An unqualified executive protected by family connections. Now something much bigger was emerging. The CEO wasn't simply defending his nephew. He was actively reshaping information to protect him. The room felt suddenly smaller, heavier, more dangerous. "Does anyone else know?" Victor shook his head. "Not yet." I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what I was seeing. If this information was real, and it certainly looked real, It wasn't merely favoritism anymore. It was deception, and not internal deception. Investor deception. The people funding North Axis believed they were receiving accurate information. The reports suggested leadership decisions were working. The reports suggested Bryce was succeeding. The reports suggested operational concerns were under control. None of that was true. Victor opened another document. This one made my stomach sink even further. Investor briefing materials. The exact packets distributed before quarterly reviews. I flipped through them, page after page. Charts, graphs, performance summaries. Everything carefully constructed. Everything reassuring. Everything incomplete. The most damaging information had either been softened or removed altogether. For the first time, I genuinely understood why investors had started asking questions. The reality wasn't matching the story, and sophisticated investors notice inconsistencies, especially when money is involved. Then Victor showed me something neither of us expected. A recent email chain, one that should have remained buried. The messages involved executive staff preparing for the upcoming investor meeting. Most of it was routine. Then one particular message appeared. Grant Holloway had written a short instruction to several senior executives. The wording was careful, professional, but the meaning was obvious. Certain operational metrics should be presented with appropriate context. Certain performance concerns should be de-emphasized. Certain discussions should remain focused on future opportunities, rather than temporary setbacks. Corporate language. Executive language. The kind of language people use when they don't want to write what they're actually doing. Victor looked at me. He's trying to get through the next investor review. I nodded. Because now I saw it too. Grant wasn't trying to fix the problem. He was trying to survive the meeting. And that realization scared me. Because desperate leaders make dangerous decisions, especially when family, reputation, and power are all on the line. Then Victor said something that completely changed the situation. There might be a bigger problem for him. What do you mean? He opened one final file, a communication summary involving one of North Axis's largest investors, a firm that held a significant ownership stake in the company. The investor had recently requested independent operational data, not executive summaries, not presentation slides, raw numbers, raw performance reports, raw outcomes. My pulse quickened. Did they get it? Victor nodded. They already have it. For a moment, neither of us spoke, because we both understood what that meant. Someone outside the company was already comparing reality against the official narrative. Someone with influence, someone with power, someone who couldn't be pressured into staying quiet. The upcoming investor meeting suddenly felt very different. Until now, Grant Holloway believed he controlled the room. He believed he controlled the information. He believed he controlled the story. What he didn't know was that at least one investor was about to walk into that meeting carrying a completely different version of the truth. And if those two versions collided, everything could collapse. The morning of the investor meeting arrived with an unusual kind of tension. Not the normal pressure that came with quarterly reviews. Something heavier. Something harder to explain. The executive floor felt nervous. Even people who weren't directly involved seemed unusually quiet. Everyone knew the meeting mattered. Nobody knew just how much. I arrived early, mostly because I couldn't focus on anything else. The entire company had spent months watching reality drift further away from the story leadership kept telling. Now those two worlds were finally about to collide. And somewhere deep down, I think people sensed it. By 9 o'clock, investors had started arriving. Some attended in person. Others joined remotely. The conference room overlooking downtown Denver slowly filled with executives, board members, advisors, and stakeholders. Grant Holloway looked completely comfortable, confident, relaxed, like a man walking into a meeting he expected to control. Bryce looked equally confident. That surprised me. Maybe because he genuinely believed the reports, or maybe because he had spent so long being protected that he assumed protection would continue forever. Either way, neither of them appeared worried. Victor and I exchanged a glance from opposite sides of the room. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to say. The numbers would speak soon enough. The presentation began exactly as expected. Grant reviewed company growth, revenue trends, expansion opportunities, market positioning, future initiatives. Everything sounded polished, professional, optimistic. Every slide painted the picture of a healthy company moving confidently toward its next phase of growth. Then Bryce took over. He walked to the front of the room carrying the confidence of someone who believed he belonged there. He spoke about leadership initiatives, operational improvements, strategic modernization, innovation, efficiency. The words sounded impressive. The problem was that many of us knew the reality behind them. Projects that had failed, budgets that had exploded, clients who were becoming frustrated, employees who had resigned. The gap between presentation and reality felt enormous. Still, nobody interrupted. Not at first. The room remained quiet. Investors listened, took notes, asked routine questions. Everything appeared normal. Then one investor raised his hand. A man named Richard Voss, representing one of North Axis's largest institutional investors. The room immediately paid attention. Richard rarely spoke unless something mattered. Grant smiled. "Of course, go ahead." Richard opened a folder sitting beside him. A thick folder. The same kind of folder Victor had warned me about. My pulse immediately quickened. Richard adjusted his glasses, then asked a simple question. "Can someone explain why these operational performance figures differ from the data our analyst received last month?" The room froze. Not dramatically, not instantly. Just enough. Just enough for everyone to feel it. Grant's smile faded slightly. Only slightly. But I noticed. So did Victor. Richard continued. "We're seeing different completion rates, different client retention numbers, and different project performance metrics." Silence. A very uncomfortable silence. Bryce looked toward Grant. Grant looked toward the CFO. The CFO looked confused. For the first time all morning, nobody seemed prepared. Grant eventually cleared his throat. "I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation." Richard nodded. "I hope so." Then he slid several printed reports across the table. The atmosphere changed immediately. Executives began reviewing the documents. Board members leaned forward. Questions started appearing on faces throughout the room. Because the differences weren't small, they were significant. Large enough that nobody could dismiss them as reporting errors. Grant's confidence visibly weakened. He tried explaining that some figures reflected different reporting periods, different methodologies, different contexts. But the explanations weren't landing. The numbers simply didn't support them. Then another investor joined the discussion. And another, and another. Suddenly the meeting was no longer about growth opportunities. It was about credibility. Every answer generated new questions. Every explanation created new concerns. The momentum had completely shifted. Then Richard delivered the blow that changed everything. Our analysts independently reviewed several major initiatives attributed to Mr. Holloway. He glanced toward Bryce. "What they found doesn't match what's being presented today." The room went dead silent. Bryce's expression changed immediately. The confidence disappeared. For the first time since receiving the promotion, he looked vulnerable. Richard opened another report. One containing detailed findings, cost overruns, project delays, missed targets, leadership concerns, evidence, actual evidence, not opinions, not rumors, facts. Page after page of facts. The board members began reading. Several looked stunned. Others looked angry. A few looked embarrassed because many of them had trusted the information they were receiving. Now that trust was being shattered in real time. Bryce attempted to defend himself, at first calmly, then nervously, then desperately. The more he spoke, the worse it became. Certain details didn't match. Certain claims couldn't be supported. Certain achievements he referenced weren't actually his. Investors noticed. Board members noticed. Everyone noticed. Then came the moment that ended his credibility. One board member directly asked him about a major operational improvement listed under his leadership portfolio. Bryce hesitated. just for a second. But it was enough. Because the person who had actually led that project wasn't Bryce. It was Elaine Porter. And several people in the room knew it. The board member looked at him. "Did you personally lead this initiative?" Bryce couldn't answer immediately. That hesitation spoke louder than any response ever could. The room erupted into questions. Suddenly, executives were being challenged from every direction. Grant attempted to regain control. He couldn't. The meeting had escaped him. Years of authority, months of manipulation, all unraveling, right in front of investors. Then Richard revealed the final piece. The independent data review had uncovered reporting discrepancies. Not accidental discrepancies. Consistent discrepancies. Patterns. Patterns suggesting information had been selectively presented. The implication was devastating. Nobody explicitly accused Grant of misconduct. They didn't need to. The evidence was already doing that. I watched his face as realization finally set in. This wasn't a difficult meeting anymore. This wasn't a public relations problem. This was a survival problem. A board member requested a private executive session. Immediately. Another supported the request. Then another. The motion passed within minutes. An internal investigation was formally announced before the meeting even ended. The room felt surreal. For months, employees had watched reality get buried beneath politics and favoritism. Now reality was fighting its way back to the surface, and nobody could stop it. As people began leaving the room, Bryce sat motionless in his chair. Grant looked 10 years older than he had that morning. Neither man seemed capable of understanding how quickly everything had collapsed. But from where I stood, the answer was simple. You can ignore employees. You can silence managers. You can protect family. You can manipulate narratives. But eventually someone starts following the numbers. And numbers have a habit of telling the truth. The weeks following the investor meeting were unlike anything I had ever experienced at North Axis. For years, decisions had flowed from the top without challenge. Now everything seemed to be moving in the opposite direction. Committees appeared. Auditors arrived. Board members started asking questions nobody had asked before. The confidence that had protected Grant Holloway for years was gone. And without that confidence, the entire leadership structure suddenly looked fragile. Employees felt it immediately. The atmosphere inside headquarters changed almost overnight. People who had spent months walking on eggshells started speaking more openly. Managers who previously avoided difficult conversations suddenly wanted answers. Questions that had been ignored were now being investigated. The company was finally looking at itself honestly. The board's investigation lasted several weeks, long enough for rumors to spread, long enough for uncertainty to grow. But eventually the results became impossible to hide. The findings weren't released publicly in full, but enough information circulated internally to tell the story. The investigation confirmed that critical performance concerns had not been properly disclosed. Leadership decisions had bypassed normal evaluation processes. Certain reporting practices failed to meet the standards investors expected. And perhaps most importantly, the promotion of Bryce Holloway could not be justified by the company's own performance data. The board acted quickly. Bryce was removed from the executive director position. Officially, the company described it as a leadership restructuring. Nobody believed that. Employees knew exactly what had happened. For months, competence had been ignored. Now reality had finally caught up. Grant Holloway remained CEO for a short time after that. But the damage was already done. Investors had lost confidence. Board members had lost confidence. Even senior executives had begun distancing themselves. A few months later, Grant announced his resignation. The official statement spoke about pursuing new opportunities and supporting a smooth transition. Again, nobody believed it. His departure felt less like a career move and more like the final consequence of a decision that should never have happened. The day the announcement was released, I walked through the office and noticed something unusual. People were smiling, not celebrating, not gloating, just relieved. Relieved that the truth had finally mattered. Relieved that years of effort hadn't been completely meaningless. Relieved that the company finally had a chance to move forward. As for Bryce, he quietly disappeared from the business. No farewell speech. No leadership transition tour. No public explanation. One day he was there. The next day he wasn't. And strangely enough, nobody seemed interested in defending him anymore. The protection had vanished the moment accountability arrived. What surprised me most was what happened next. For months, I had imagined winning, getting the promotion, taking Bryce's position, proving everyone wrong. But that's not what happened. The board launched a nationwide search for new leadership. External candidates, industry veterans, experienced executives, people with backgrounds much bigger than mine. And honestly, I was okay with that. Because somewhere during the investigation, my priorities had changed. I no longer cared about beating Bryce. I cared about working in a company where merit actually mattered. A few weeks later, I was invited to meet with several board members. The conversation wasn't what I expected. They didn't offer me Bryce's former position. Instead, they offered me something far more meaningful. A newly created role overseeing operational transformation across the entire company. A role designed to rebuild systems, improve accountability, and ensure performance data remained transparent. The board wanted someone employees trusted. Someone who understood what had gone wrong. Someone who had lived through it. For the first time in a long time, an opportunity felt earned. Not gifted. Not inherited. Earned. I accepted immediately. The promotion wasn't flashy. It didn't come with a dramatic title. It didn't make headlines, but it represented something far more valuable. Trust. The thing North Axis had nearly destroyed. The thing we now had to rebuild. Looking back, the biggest lesson wasn't about nepotism. It wasn't even about Bryce. The real lesson was about what happens when leaders start believing rules apply to everyone except themselves. Because eventually, reality catches up. Maybe not immediately. Maybe not when employees complain. Maybe not when managers raise concerns. But eventually someone asks questions that can't be avoided. And when that happens, truth becomes very difficult to bury. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that unfair systems survive because most people assume someone else will speak up. Most employees stay quiet because they don't want to risk their careers. Most managers stay quiet because they don't want conflict. And sometimes that silence allows bad decisions to grow into major problems. At North Axis, dozens of talented people saw what was happening long before investors did. But it wasn't until evidence reached people with real leverage that accountability finally arrived. That's why performance matters. That's why transparency matters. And that's why leadership should never be treated like a family inheritance. Because companies built on favoritism eventually run out of excuses. And when the numbers finally tell the truth, even the most powerful people in the room can lose everything.